Picture this: a young military captain, barely in his 30s, staring down one of the most dangerous insurgencies in Africa. That's Ibrahim Traoré, the guy who didn't just lead Burkina Faso from a fancy office, but threw himself into the fire. Now here's the wild part. Rumor has it he once ditched his uniform, slipped on some local threads, and walked straight into a rebel camp like he was just another guy looking for trouble. Why? To see the enemy's face up close. Crazy, right? What kind of leader risks it all like that? And what did he find in that camp that flipped his entire mission upside down? Stick around, because this story's about to get nuts. Into the lion's den, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't your average military captain. At 34, he was already battle-hardened, having faced jihadist insurgents in Burkina Faso's brutal northern fronts. But this mission? This was next level. Word had spread among his trusted circle about a rebel camp deep in the Sahel, a stronghold buzzing with activity. Not just any camp. This one was rumored to be a nerve center for the insurgents tearing his country apart. Most leaders would have sent drones or a strike team. Traoré? He decided to go himself, disguised, alone, and with nothing but his wits. Blending in, the camp was nestled in a rocky valley, hidden by acacia trees and the endless stretch of desert. Traoré ditched his military gear for a worn-out chalabia, the kind of robe locals wore. He smeared dirt on his face, let his beard grow scruffy, and practiced the slang of the region's nomadic traders. If he was caught, there'd be no backup, no extraction. One wrong move, and he'd be a goner. He slipped into the camp at dusk, posing as a merchant looking to trade supplies. The rebels, suspicious but greedy for goods, let him in. His heart was pounding, but his face cool as a desert night. Eyes everywhere inside. The camp was a chaotic hive. Armed men patrolled with AK-47s slung over their shoulders, barking orders. Tents were packed with crates, ammo, food, maybe worse. Traoré kept his head down, haggling over fake deals while memorizing every detail. He noticed the fighters weren't just locals. Some had accents from Mali, others from Niger. This wasn't a ragtag crew. It was a coalition. He overheard snippets of plans, attacks on villages, ambushes on military outposts. But something else caught his ear. Talk of a big delivery coming soon. Weapons? Money? He needed to know more. The risky play, to get closer, Traoré took a gamble. He offered to fix a busted generator, claiming he'd done it for traders before. The rebels, short on tech skills, bought it. For hours, he tinkered under their watchful eyes, all while eavesdropping on their commanders. That's when he saw it. A map pinned to a tent wall, marked with targets across Burkina Faso. Cities, military bases, even schools. His stomach churned. This camp wasn't just a hideout, it was the heart of a coordinated campaign to plunge his country into chaos. But the clock was ticking, and he couldn't stay much longer without raising suspicion. A game of shadows. Traoré's time in the rebel camp was like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Every glance, every word had to be calculated. The camp was alive with movement. Fighters training in the distance, the clatter of weapons being cleaned, and the low hum of generators powering their makeshift war machine. Dust hung in the air, mixing with the smell of sweat and gun oil. Traoré, still posing as a wandering merchant, kept his cover by bartering fake goods, some old tools and sacks of grain he'd acquired for the act. But his real mission was to dig deeper into that big delivery he'd overheard. Less inner circle. To get answers, Traoré needed to get closer to the camp's leaders. Easier said than done. The commanders stuck to a heavily guarded tent at the camp's center, surrounded by loyal fighters who eyed strangers like hawks. Traoré noticed a pattern. Every evening, a small group gathered near the tent for tea, a ritual that doubled as a strategy session. If he could get in on that, he might hear something game-changing. So, he played his next card. He casually mentioned to a low-ranking fighter that he'd once smuggled tea from Mali. Top-quality stuff, impossible to find in the desert. The guy bit, and soon Traore was invited to share his stash with the group. Eavesdropping under pressure. Sitting cross-legged on a rug, pouring tea with a steady hand, Traore was inches from men who'd slit his throat if they knew who he was. The commanders were a mix, some grizzled veterans with scars telling stories of old battles, others younger, fiery, and itching for chaos. As they sipped, they let their guard down, joking about recent raids. Traore's ears perked up when one mentioned the delivery again. It wasn't just weapons or cash. It was foreign support, supplies, maybe even fighters, coming from across the border. The name of a shadowy middleman, someone called the broker, kept coming up. Traore's mind raced. Was this proof of outside forces fueling Burkina Faso's nightmare? A close call. Just when he thought he'd hit the jackpot, things nearly unraveled. One of the younger commanders, a wiry guy with a permanent scowl, started grilling Traore about his trading routes. Where'd he come from? Why travel alone? The air got heavy, and Traore felt every eye on him. He spun a quick story about dodging military checkpoints and bribing officials, tossing in just enough local slang to sound legit. The scowler wasn't fully convinced, but got distracted when a radio crackled with news of a nearby skirmish. Traore exhaled silently, his palms sweaty. He'd dodged a bullet, but he knew his luck wouldn't hold forever. He had to find a way to see that delivery, or at least confirm what it was, before his cover was blown. Tiptoeing through the chaos. The rebel camp was a pressure cooker, and Ibrahim Traoré was deep in it, every second a gamble. By now, he'd been there for 2 days, his merchant disguise holding but fraying at the edges. The camp sprawled across the valley like a makeshift fortress, tents and tarps stretched between boulders, camouflaged by thorny shrubs. At night, the place glowed faintly from lanterns and the occasional flare of a cigarette. The sounds were relentless. The rhythmic thud of boots on patrol, the crackle of radios, and the distant howl of hyenas circling the desert. Traoré's nerves were razor-sharp, but he kept his face relaxed, his voice steady, blending into the camp's rhythm like he belonged. Hunting for the delivery. That big delivery was his obsession now. He'd caught enough whispers to know it was massive, something that could tip the scales of Burkina Faso's insurgency. But details were scarce, and the clock was ticking. Traoré spent his days weaving through the camp, striking up chats with fighters while pretending to barter. He'd trade stories for information, offering tales of fictional deals in Timbuktu for scraps about the camp's operations. One fighter, a lanky kid barely 20, let slip that the delivery was due at midnight, hidden in a convoy of battered pickup trucks. The kid didn't know what was coming, but he bragged about new toys that'd make the army regret crossing them. Traoré nodded, masking his urgency. He needed to see those trucks. The midnight stakeout. Getting near the delivery zone was suicide. The camp's northern edge, where the convoy was expected, was crawling with sentries, hardened fighters with night vision goggles and twitchy trigger fingers. Traoré improvised. He'd noticed a pile of discarded crates near the camp's makeshift latrines, a spot so foul nobody lingered there. Under the guise of checking his goods, he hauled a sack to the crates at dusk, then slipped beneath a tarp, burying himself in the stench and shadows. For hours he lay still, ignoring the scuttle of scorpions and the ache in his cramped legs. His only tools were a small knife tucked in his boot and a mental map of the camp's layout. If he was spotted, there'd be no talking his way out. What the trucks revealed, just past midnight, the rumble of engines broke the silence. Traoré peered through a slit in the tarp, his pulse hammering. 3 trucks rolled in, their headlights dimmed, kicking up clouds of dust. Rebels swarmed them, unloading crates with practiced efficiency. In the faint glow of a lantern, Traoré caught glimpses of the cargo. Heavy machine guns, RPGs, and boxes stamped with foreign markings, Arabic, maybe Turkish. But then came the real shock. Among the crates were medical supplies, stacks of cash in plastic wrap, and satellite phones. This wasn't just an arms deal. It was a lifeline for the insurgency, bankrolled by someone with deep pockets. Traoré's mind raced. The broker's network was bigger than he'd feared, and Burkina Faso was just one piece of a larger game. But as the rebels started dispersing, a sentry's flashlight swept dangerously close to his hiding spot, and he knew he'd pushed his luck. He had to move, or this would be his last night in the Sahel. The great escape Ibrahim Traoré was in over his head, crouched under a filthy tarp with the rebel sentry's flashlight slicing through the darkness just a meters away. The camp was still buzzing from the midnight delivery, crates of weapons, cash, and satellite phones now stashed in tents, guarded by fighters hyped up on adrenaline and suspicion. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Traoré's hiding spot near the latrines was a desperate choice, the stench of waste and decay cloaking him, but barely dulling the panic in his chest. He'd seen enough to know this camp was no small-time operation. It was a cog in a machine stretching far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. But knowing it and getting out alive were two very different things. Slipping through the cracks. The sentry's beam passed, and Traoré seized the moment. He eased out from under the tarp, his movement slow and deliberate, like a predator avoiding a trap. The camp was a maze of shadows with flickering lanterns casting jagged shapes on the rocky ground. He stuck to the edges, weaving between tents and piles of junk, old tires, broken crates, anything that could hide him. His merchant disguise was still intact, but it wouldn't hold up if someone got a good look at his face. He'd memorized the camp's layout over the past 2 days, every patrol route and blind spot burned into his mind. The northern exit, where the trucks had come in, was his best shot, but it was crawling with guards celebrating their new arsenal. He needed a distraction. Stirring the hornet's nest, Traoré's mind churned as he crept toward a cluster of fuel cans near the camp's motor pool. The rebels had parked their trucks and motorbikes there, a sloppy setup with no real security. He spotted a rag dangling from a crate, likely used to wipe engine oil. Perfect. He grabbed it, soaked it in fuel from a leaking can, and wedged it near a stack of jerry cans. With a flint from his pocket, standard for any soldier in the Sahel, he sparked a tiny flame, just enough to start a slow burn. He didn't stick around to watch. Seconds later, a muffled whoosh erupted as the fire caught, sending a plume of black smoke into the night sky. Shouts rang out, and rebels sprinted toward the blaze, leaving the northern exit wide open. Traoré's gamble had paid off, but the clock was ticking. The stash to freedom, he moved fast, keeping low, his worn-out sandals slapping the dirt as he bolted for the exit. The desert stretched out beyond, a vast, moonlit void that promised freedom if he could just reach it. But the camp was waking up. The fire had drawn attention, but it also meant every fighter was on edge, rifles at the ready. A shout behind him. Someone had spotted a shadow moving too fast. Traoré didn't look back. He zigzagged through the last line of tents, dodging a burst of gunfire that kicked up dust at his heels. His heart pounded like a war drum, but his training kept him sharp. He dove behind a boulder just outside the camp, pressing himself flat as rebels scanned the darkness, their flashlights slashing wildly. They were close, too close, but the chaos of the fire kept them disorganized. Traoré waited, counting seconds, then sprinted into the desert, the camp's glow fading behind him. He'd made it out, but what he'd seen would haunt him, and the fight was far from over. The weight of the truth. Ibrahim Traoré was a ghost in the desert now, his silhouette swallowed by the vast Sahel as he put distance between himself and the rebel camp. The night was frigid, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but sweat still clung to his skin from the adrenaline of his escape. His worn sandals crunched against the rocky terrain, each step a reminder of how close he'd come to not making it out. The camp's chaos, gunfire, shouts, the crackling fire he'd set, faded into a distant hum, but the images burned in his mind. Crates of foreign weapons, stacks of cash, satellite phones, and that name, the broker, tying it all together. He'd seen the insurgency's pulse, and it was stronger than anyone in Ouagadougou had feared. A lone trek through the void. Traore had no map, no compass, just the stars and his soldier's instinct to guide him toward a military outpost some 30 kilometers away. The desert was no friend. Sandstorms could erase tracks, and jackals prowled for easy prey. His water was long gone, his throat dry as the cracked earth beneath him. He tore a strip from his jalabia to wrap his face against the wind, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. The rebels might not know who he was, but they'd know someone had slipped their net, and they weren't the type to let that slide. Every rustle in the dark made his hand twitch toward the knife in his boot, though he knew it'd be useless against a patrol. He pushed forward, driven by what he'd uncovered and the need to get it to someone who could act. Piecing it together. As he trudged, Traore's mind worked overtime, stitching together the camp's secrets. The weapons, RPGs, machine guns, crates with Arabic and possibly Turkish markings, pointed to a supply chain crossing borders. The cash and medical supplies meant the insurgents could sustain themselves for months, maybe years. Those satellite phones? They weren't for local calls. Someone was coordinating this, someone with resources and reach. The broker wasn't just a smuggler, he was a puppet master, funneling aid to jihadists across the Sahel. Traore thought of the map he'd glimpsed, its red marks on villages, schools, and military bases. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore, it was a regional wildfire, and his country was ground zero. He clenched his fists, the weight of it all settling like a stone in his gut. The dawn of resolve. By dawn, Traore was dehydrated, his lips cracked, his legs screaming for rest. A faint smudge on the horizon signaled the outpost, a ramshackle cluster of concrete and barbed wire. He staggered toward it, waving off the startled guards who raised their rifles before recognizing their captain's face beneath the dirt and exhaustion. Collapsing in the shade of a wall, he gulped water from a canteen and began relaying what he'd seen, his voice hoarse but urgent. The outpost commander listened, wide-eyed, as Traore described the camp, the delivery, and the broker's shadow looming over it all. This wasn't just intelligence. It was a wake-up call. Traore knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but what he'd witnessed had hardened his resolve. The insurgency wasn't just a war. It was a betrayal of his people, and he'd stop at nothing to cut it off at the root. The shocking revelation. Ibrahim Traoré sat in the dim light of the military outpost, his body aching, but his mind on fire. As he recounted the rebel camp's secrets to the stunned commander, one detail kept clawing at him. Those foreign-marked crates, the cash, the satellite phones, and the broker's name whispered like a curse. Then it hit him, a realization so explosive it felt like the ground shifted beneath him. The insurgency wasn't just getting random aid. It was being orchestrated by a network with ties to players far beyond the Sahel. The markings on the crates, the sophisticated gear, the cash flow, it all pointed to a chilling truth. Powerful external forces, possibly state-backed, were funneling resources to destabilize Burkina Faso and the entire region. This wasn't just a local rebellion, it was a proxy war, and Traoré had stumbled into its heart. The stakes skyrocket. The implications were staggering. Every red mark on that camp's map, villages, schools, military posts, was a target in a calculated plan to fracture the nation. Traoré's mind flashed to the faces of civilians he'd sworn to protect, the kids playing in dusty streets, the farmers toiling under the Sahel sun. If this network succeeded, Burkina Faso could spiral into chaos, a pawn in a geopolitical game where lives were just collateral damage. His infiltration had uncovered a truth bigger than he'd ever imagined, one that could reshape the fight. But it also painted a target on his back. The broker's reach was long, and Traoré knew that leaking this intel could spark retaliation, not just against him, but against his entire country. Yet, he also knew silence wasn't an option. This discovery wasn't just a lead, it was a call to action, and he'd have to rally his forces, expose the network, and strike before the next delivery tightened the noose around his nation's throat. Wrapping up the wild ride. So there you have it, the insane tale of Ibrahim Traoré, the captain who didn't just fight the insurgency from a desk, but dove headfirst into a rebel camp, risking it all to uncover a truth that hit like a grenade. He saw the crates, the cash, the shadowy fingerprints of a global network fueling chaos in Burkina Faso. It wasn't just a mission. It was a wake-up call that the fight was bigger, messier, and way more dangerous than anyone thought. Traoré walked out of that desert with intel that could change the game, but also with the weight of knowing his country was caught in a high-stakes chess match. What a guy, right? Let's keep the fire going. This story's got us all on the edge of our seats, so let's keep the vibes alive. Drop a like if Traoré's gutsy move blew your mind, and hit that subscribe button for more epic tales that dig into the wild side of history. Got thoughts? Spill them in the comments. What would you do if you were in Traoré's sandals, staring down a camp full of rebels? Or, bigger question, who's the broker, and how deep does this rabbit hole go? Let's get the conversation rolling and unpack this madness together.